I'm Dr. Jonathan Ross. I'm the secretary and chair of the committee that is working on these Zoom conferences. And we want to speak tonight about the Supreme Court's recent decisions and how they're going to impact healthcare in the US and perhaps even some perspectives even globally from one of our experts who has worked in that field as well. With us tonight is, and if you guys could just wave, because you just all are on one big group for me, I can't tell whether people will know who's who, but we're going to kick this off with Steve Wagner. Steve is the executive director of the Universal Healthcare Action Network of Ohio. He's got a law and public health background. And what we're hoping to do here is to have him talk with us first about the trials and tribulations of the ACA with regard to the Supreme Court. And then he wants to speak a little bit about the latest action around health reform that occurred within the Inflation Reduction Act that just was passed. Steve, do you want to go ahead and kick it off?
John teed this part of it off already. Just to be clear, UCAN Ohio's mission is to achieve high quality, affordable health care for all Ohioans by promoting anti-racism and ensuring that marginalized communities are heard. We are very much about helping to bring the people's voices that are impacted, marginalized, minoritized, to policymakers so that better decisions can be made. So I'm sorry, I need to move this control bar a little. And so, wow, since the ACA, there's been at least 2,000 times that the ACA has been challenged in court in at different levels, and of course, some of that's reached the Supreme Court, and I'll touch on that. Because of the most recent case, I am going to go back a little bit in time to kind of highlight some of the previous cases, just so you're aware of some of what's happened. Oops, I skipped through. So 2012 was a pretty significant case, oftentimes referred to simply as NFIB versus Sebelius. Secretary Sebelius, at that time HHS secretary. This was the case that first said that much of the ACA was constitutional, so that this individual mandate was a constitutional authority of Congress's taxing power. That'll be important, but that's why they believe the ACA was constitutional. That's part of this overall theme later on about why there might other challenges to the ACA. The bad part of this decision, in terms of policy, was that the decision was made that states couldn't be forced to expand Medicaid. So that's where there were 26 states that joined. They didn't want to expand Medicaid at that time. The penalty was that if you didn't expand Medicaid, you'd lose your share of funding from the federal government. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. It can be optional, and therefore the states that decide to do it can expand, and that whole process in terms of an enhanced reimbursement rate can occur, but you can't force a state to do so. And fortunately, we only have a handful of states that have still failed to provide coverage to those needy individuals that could qualify under an expanded Medicaid. In King versus Burwell, this was taking a look at the fact that some states chose to operate their own exchange, but other states like Ohio decided, well, we prefer the federal government help operate that for us. And somebody said, well, wait, the language says that this has to do with states operating an exchange. It can't be legal if the Fed is doing it for the states. Supreme Court said, no, that's okay. And that would completely oppose the intent of the law if that kind of argument was allowed to stand. The most recent case that we saw in the Supreme Court brings up again this whole issue of that the legality of the marketplace in the ACA stood upon this whole ability for the Congress to exercise its taxing authority. So you remember, during the Trump administration, Congress's attempt to do away with the ACA, Senator McCain's famous no vote, but in the end, they were able to pass an elimination of the actual tax penalty. So that basically set it back to zero. They were able to do that in reconciliation, which only requires 51 votes in the Senate, because it had to do with the taxing authority. They couldn't get rid of the whole of the ACA with 51 votes because for things that are policy, you need 60 votes in the Senate. So in the end, the court decided this based not on whether or not this was constitutional or not, but basically said, look, nobody's hurt by having a zero penalty levied against them. None of the individuals that have sued here have in any way been harmed. Therefore, you don't have standing to bring suit. They didn't actually decide whether or not there was any problem with constitutionality here. I do want to bring up 3 additional cases before I move on to a case that may move its way all the way to the Supreme Court. These are the cases having to do with contraceptives and the preventive health benefits. So what happened in Little Sisters of the Poor is that it became this ability for these nonprofits, these religious, what would be considered religious organizations, or those to have in this case, religious nonprofits, to basically say that they're accepted from certain of the rules. This came up further in Hobby Lobby, where again there was this religious exception, and then again in Zubik versus Burwell, again religious nonprofits. It's important to note that throughout this has been these organizations that are identifying as being owned or nonprofit. They're not these publicly traded companies. That they're able to get around some of these requirements of the ACA because of religious exceptions. And in this case, it was about contraceptive coverage again. This is important. Actually, Little Sisters of the Poor. And not worth. Since I already mentioned that, this is important because the case that I think might make it again to the Supreme Court, which was heard by Justice Reed O'Connor, who he was the one who had heard the Texas v. California case in 2021 that the Supreme Court ruled on. He is again ruled to basically invalidate the ACA's preventive health coverage. There is also a significant relationship between this current plaintiff and the plaintiffs in that past case as well. It's important to note that the way in which we have many of these preventive health requirements is they occur through 3 committees, either ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the Preventive Services Task Force, or HRSA itself. In this case, Judge O'Connor, so the argument was that normally if you're going to make, Congress can't delegate certain things out of the way in which there's balances of power between Congress and the executive branch. And that that when they do move that out, the executive branch has to do its duty. So in this case, there was the argument that because this decision about what had to be in a health plan had been moved to these three committees, that those had to be subject to all of the conditions that the executive branch would normally have. And in this case, Judge O'Connor decided that it probably met it for ACIP, the immunization practices in HRSA, because eventually the secretary had to approve it. So it fell under somebody who had been appointed and confirmed by Congress, and so that it probably met that. But for the Preventive Services Task Force, which actually can't be terminated by the president, that it probably violated the requirement of the appointment clause. So that would, in this case, Judge O'Connor was arguing that, or I shouldn't say arguing, Judge O'Connor held that would invalidate the requirement for those preventive health services in the ACA. He also then said that requiring insurers to cover PrEP, many of you would know PrEP is used to help prevent the transmission of HIV, so to reduce viral loads to being virtually non-existent, so it can't be transmitted. The judge said in this case that violated religious freedom to require that. Anytime you're interfering with someone's rights, you need to use the least restrictive means, and he was saying that was not the least restrictive means. So this case is going to make its way up in all likelihood. Whether it gets to the Supreme Court or not is still left to be seen, but that will likely be one of our next cases. So I'm going to totally shift gears now here. So there were a number of health provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. One of the big ones that's pretty important to us because we are ACA navigators is the fact that the advanced premium tax credits, so the help that some people get with affording their health insurance, it changed for another 3 years the way in which those were calculated. So you can see this is the current ACA, or I should say the past ACA. This is what happened with the COVID relief and then has been captured in the Inflation Reduction Act. It actually provides some relief at a fairly wide income level, including the fact that while people over 400% were originally not eligible for subsidies, this basically caps your premium at 8.5% of your income. That's important because it also determines whether or not the plan that's offered by your employer is considered to be affordable. So it has to be less than 8.5% of your income. Enhanced, for those on Medicare, there are low-income subsidies that are present. It provided some relief there. So, for example, or some of the co-payments and changing some of that, decreased the annual deductible. And it also, the LIS originally had sort of this partial relief and a full relief, and it did away with that. So if you qualify for LIS benefits, you qualify and you're getting that relief. This will be interesting to see how it plays out, but it's basically the ability finally for Medicare to be able to negotiate prices as Medicare. There'll be 10 drugs, Part D drugs in 2026. It's going to be a pretty slow rollout, but you know, there are quite a number of drugs that are very frequently part of the Medicare program, and so it'll give them some leverage there. How that plays out in terms of changing the price in other people's insurance plans outside of Medicare is still left to be seen. The important thing is, and do I have, I will mention that that it also puts limits on how the Part D drug benefit premiums can increase. They can't go higher than the rate of inflation that's there. So it keeps insurers from pushing that change in how much people make into the premium cost. Lower cost sharing. This is pretty critical. I think the biggest thing that I see is the $2,000 out-of-pocket spending. So that will make a difference for a significant percentage of people on Medicare. And then the other thing that was talked about in the news was this attempt to get in an insulin cap on the copay for insulin products. All of this legislation was done through reconciliation, which only requires 51 votes. If you want to do something that does not impact the federal budget, and the Senate parliamentarian determines that, if you want to do that, you need 60 votes. They weren't able to get 60 votes to have this insulin copay apply outside of government healthcare spending, Medicare. So they couldn't get it to apply to the ACA or to employer coverage. They could only get it to apply to Medicare. And that's because they were doing this under reconciliation. Eliminates cost sharing for adult vaccines, which is pretty important. And then in Medicaid, it eliminates that cost sharing. I put adult vaccines, but that also applies to CHIP, which is kids. I do want to mention before I close out, what didn't make it into the IRA that's still sitting back there. One of the big things Senator Warnock was trying to push to happen was, we talked before, there's a bunch of states that have not expanded Medicaid, and this was going to provide a way in which people that would have fallen into that Medicaid expansion in those states could have gotten coverage. It would have provided millions of people with healthcare coverage in that case. I know I'm running a little short, so I will just hope that you've had a moment to read those. Deb will make the slides available, and I will move on. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. A lot of interesting stuff there. I guess one of the things that comes to my mind, and we'll maybe delay the questions for you if you can stay. Do you have time to hang out till the rest of the speakers have a chance to speak and then go back to questions? Because I've got several of them. Most importantly, if there's any estimates out there on what the health impact of some of these things will be, either positive or negative, and just would be curious about those issues. So we're going to delay taking questions on Steve until we've heard from our other two speakers. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Mardge Cohen, who's an internist practicing in Chicago with homeless and HIV, people with HIV, and she's an expert on these things, but she's also done a substantial amount of work overseas, including in post-genocide Rwanda, where she was working with women with HIV there as well. And we're going to ask her to speak on what the impact of the Dobbs decision would be on our health, and will that resonate into bigger issues. So Mardge, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thanks. Actually, because you mentioned to me right before this started that you wanted a little bit of a global perspective, I just actually did make 3 slides that I think are worth showing related to the global perspective, and then I'm going to return to the Dobbs decision, which is what I actually prepared. Let me find my slides that I just made. Okay. So, can you all see this?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, so I think this is very interesting. This is a world map, and blue means that, you can get them on abortions of the world, and it's shaded in by abortion availability rules. And the blue, which is the majority, kind of almost a little bit more than half, shows like it's very, very available, and it's basically on request. And then you can see there's gradations, and yellow means it's to preserve the health of either the child or the mother. Red is to preserve the mother's life. And then the darker sort of wine color, I hope you guys can see the same coloring as me, or else is prohibited altogether. And the US at this point is sort of, it has restrictions, parental restrictions, and it has, statewide different restrictions. And that's what we're going to go into in a little bit. But on the next slide, if I can remember how to do this, click
on the slide if you can. I think it'll.
Oh, okay, that's a good idea. If I could find out where that is.
There you go.
Up on top?
Well, I've got global abortion statistics in front of me, so I can see it.
Yeah, okay, there it is. So, okay, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. I think, so I thought this was interesting. This shows us that the majority of women actually have reproductive age, but 60%, or 970 million women, live in countries that broadly allow abortion, whereas 41% live under restrictive laws. And so 700 million women of reproductive age don't have access to safe and legal abortion care. Enormous number of women. And according to the WHO, 23,000 women die of unsafe abortions each year, with tens of thousands more experiencing significant health complications. And importantly, legal restrictions don't result in fewer abortions necessarily, but instead they compel women to risk their lives and health by seeking out unsafe abortion care. And then the last slide, if you can make that happen again. This was the most interesting part of thinking about global issues, how far behind we are, because how far many countries who you wouldn't think would be making these changes are making changes. So Oaxaca in Mexico decriminalized abortion, a very Catholic country. The UK voted overwhelmingly. This was very exciting for many, I know, and it was a really amazing struggle to adopt legislative provisions extending abortion rights to Northern Ireland and legalizing same-sex marriage. Kenya holding abortion lawful on both physical and mental health grounds. Iceland to have one of England's most abortion laws, permitting abortion to 22 weeks. North Macedonia removed regressive barriers to abortion. And South Korea, which, I mean, when you think of the countries that, holds laws, restrictive abortion laws, unconstitutional. So the world seems to be doing better than us, actually, at this point. So I'm going to stop sharing and just talk about what I was going to talk about. And thank you for having me. I think of the overturning of Roe in June as a national tragedy that was really decades in the making. It was a very well orchestrated frontal assault to deny women control of their bodies. It was followed by Senator Graham's, federal legislation recently introduced to prohibit abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy nationwide. And if a physician violates that law, they could face up to 5 years in prison. Although this is probably an election year ploy to make Republicans toe the line, we still have to think of this challenge as very important and reframe the issue so that we need to understand it in a different way, and so that we could actually succeed to become a country that actually does the right thing. The US is only, so I think the way of framing it is the reproductive justice agenda. Reproductive justice is defined as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, the right to have children or not to have children, and to parent children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And a group of African-American women defined reproductive justice in Chicago in 1994. And this combination of reproductive rights and social justice prioritizes access instead of choice, and general health and community well-being, and not just abortion. So I think the way to think about this attack in the context of reproductive justice is in 4 areas. 1, the attack on women's autonomy, health, and well-being. 2, stopping the criminalization of pregnancy, which is fostered by the current laws and changes in the Supreme Court decision. 3, thinking about the impact on gay and trans health rights. And 4, how it limits democracy for all of us. So first, on the attack on women's autonomy and health. Clearly, women should not be forced to get pregnant or continue unwanted pregnancies. Women should control their own bodies and be supported to make their own decisions related to contraception and pregnancy. And 2/3 of states will soon have laws prohibiting abortion or not providing legal protection for those who seek or provide abortions. 36% of U.S. women between 15 and 44 will be largely unable to obtain an elective abortion in the state that they live. Nationwide, it's estimated that abortion rates will fall by about 13%. So access to safe and affordable abortion care can also not only affect one's health, but it improves economic, social outcomes as well as health outcomes. It's not a coincidence that the same states that made it harder for women to access abortion in legal ways prior to Dobbs are the ones that are most likely to have other policies in place supporting women's economic security. For example, women living in states where abortion is far less likely to be don't have access to government safety net programs to aid their economic well-being. They don't have refundable earned income tax credit. They don't have child tax credits. There's not expanded Medicaid. They don't have high-quality childcare or universal pre-kindergarten. Similarly, none of those states restricting abortion currently offer paid family and medical leave, and only 1 offers paid sick time. Conversely, we know that eliminating abortion restrictions would increase labor force participation for women and earnings. They could even impact the gender wage gap. Lots of research over decades has shown that abortion increases women's labor force participation by allowing them to control when and whether they have children. And the effect is most pronounced for Black women and teenagers because they're more likely to seek abortion care due to the ways systemic racism creates barriers to accessing health care, such as contraception. And access to abortion care, therefore, is a critical tool toward ensuring young women and Black women to have autonomy over education and career pathways. Clearly, abortion is related to further educational credentials, and that's a key driver for upper economic mobility. So reproductive justice is essential for women to be able to pursue well-paying career pathways. Forced pregnancies will lead to a generation of children and families that are coerced into poverty due to the lack of abortion access. And economic impacts, alongside with the impact on health and well-being of the lack of a care infrastructure and abortion bans, will really be devastating. And of course, these continually to differentially impact Black and working class and poor communities. And I think it's important to understand the restrictions in the context of our inequitable healthcare system, which is why we need a single payer system, and a very high national maternal mortality rate. So Black maternal mortality is very high, with Black women 3 times more likely to die than white women. For Black women, being pregnant is much more dangerous than having an abortion. There are also restrictions for incarcerated people with unwanted pregnancies who won't have access. It'll be much more difficult, and needed abortion services may not be available at the time that states require them to be available. And clearly, and I'm sure the next speaker will talk more about this, efforts to ban mail order abortion medication access is underway, even though access to FDA-approved medications could, in many cases, allow women to manage their own abortions without any restrictions. 2, turning to criminalization of pregnancy. For decades, pregnant people across America have been subjected to criminalization and deprivation of liberty on the basis of pregnancy or pregnancy outcomes. Women have been targeted by police, prosecutors, healthcare providers, child welfare workers, judges, who sought to deprive them of their constitutional rights in the name of fetal personhood. And there have been many cases of this since 1973 Roe ruling through 2020, there were 1,700 instances across the country in which women were arrested, prosecuted, convicted, detained, or forced to undergo medical interventions because of their pregnancy status or outcomes. And most of those cases were in the more recent era, in the last 15 years, not in the beginning. And without the protections granted by Roe, which were never enough, this criminalization will only increase. And the women subjected to pregnancy-based actions are overwhelmingly low income and disproportionately Black and brown. Pregnant or postpartum women have faced criminal charges for experiencing miscarriages and stillbirths, for having abortions, for having a healthy birth after engaging in behavior perceived as endangering their pregnancies. So pregnant people of color who use drugs are disproportionately impacted, despite the fact that Black and white pregnant women use drugs at approximately the same rate in the US. And the more power states have to pursue these types of cases, the more dire the situation will probably become. Looking at gay trans rights and the Dobbs decision, basically, I think lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer community is quite alarmed that their rights are in jeopardy now that there's the overturning of the federal constitutional abortion protection, because the LGBTQ community, two reasons: disproportionately accesses reproductive health care, with lesbian and bisexual women who have been pregnant more likely than heterosexual women who are pregnant to have had an abortion. Lesbian women report that they seek abortion more often because of physical abuse from the person who got them pregnant, and that those were significantly more likely the result of a forced sexual encounter than for heterosexual women. Trans people have become pregnant, 1/3 consider trying to end the pregnancy themselves without clinical supervision. 1 out of 5 actually went through with the attempt. And factors that have led transgender people to end their pregnancies include fear of intimate partner violence and discrimination based on provider opinion on abortion or the patient's gender identity. And finally, the right to privacy guaranteed by the 14th Amendment due process clause is the foundation of abortion rights, but it's also the bedrock for the legislation and judicial rulings for same-sex sexual intimacy and same-sex marriage. So the Supreme Court ruled in Dobbs versus Jackson that the 14th Amendment's due process protection of liberty does not include a federal right to abortion. And that obviously could have impact on what it means for gay people in terms of marriages and whoever they want to love. There's also an important issue of increasing anti-trans legislation across the country. And while most of the 240 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced so far this year propose restrictions on the lives of transgender children in medical and educational settings, but really part of a growing wave of anti-LGBTQ legislation overall. And notable in this trend have been efforts to limit school employees from discussing gender identity, sexual orientation, and race, such as Florida's recently passed Don't Say Gay law, and to ban libraries from carrying books related to these topics. So I think the implications of the impact of this decision are great. And finally, lastly, number 4, for us to think about it as an attack on all of our democracy. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has said that the Dobbs decision takes away bodily autonomy for millions of women, in particular those with low incomes and those belonging to racial and ethnic minorities, as we've said so far. But that's to the detriment of their fundamental rights. After all, it's a ruling that permits forced births, limits the healthcare of people who can become pregnant, paves the way for criminalization of people who have miscarriages, and burdens rather than protects vulnerable minority people. And on these counts, it weakens the principles for all of us of a free and democratic society. I think the pretext for caring for people are laid bare as the same states that have increased abortion restrictions and reduced life-saving economic resources also have increased voting suppression. So we need to respond loudly and vigorously as our democracy is threatened by those who maintain power by oppressing women. And I can't this week not say that we should be inspired by the women of Iran to stand firm and fight for control of our bodies against a theocratic authoritarianism, which is similarly on the rise in our own country. Thank you.
Thanks, Marge. That was super. Brought up a whole bunch of things that I'm sure are going to stimulate questions. Yeah. You know, I know you, although you have cared for women and have been involved in the care of women forever, you've, for the most part, I'm guessing as an internist, you didn't have to manage the pregnancy part of it. And our next speaker has to look patients in the eyes all the time, dealing with what are very complicated situations. So I'm going to ask May Winchester, who's a maternal fetal medicine specialist, to go ahead and talk with us. She is representing Physicians for Reproductive Rights. And there's a branch of that here in Ohio. When the Dobbs decision came down, they were looking for signatures in support of Roe. You know, I know that they're going to be fighting on behalf of all women and all of us, in all honesty, given the context that Mardge just put it in, that it's our democracy to some extent and our human rights that are at stake here, not just what happens to an individual pregnant woman. So if you want to learn more about Physicians for Reproductive Rights, reproductive health care, you can go to their website. May is representing them tonight to talk with us about that, what I would say in the trenches sort of perspective. So May?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I don't have any, I'm just like one more like burnt out OBGYN in this state, so I don't have like any prepared statement.
Okay.
I have an academic job here in Cleveland, and then I also moonlight at an independent abortion clinic. So I kind of see like kind of both ends of the abortion spectrum, I would say. In Ohio, we've already seen like significant, I've had my own patients that have been hurt by this bill. And a lot of it is due to the intended consequence of misinformation and fear and confusion. And, what I see a lot when people try and defend these bills is, that they put the blame on the doctor. Well, the doctor should have done this because clearly her life was at stake. Or, the doctor has all the power, like the doctor should be making the decisions. And a lot of people don't realize that's just not true if I want to keep my job. And we have to run everything by our hospital lawyer, and that varies from institution to institution, even just here in Cleveland. So the care a patient can get not only varies from state to state, but what hospital in what state you potentially go to and what the lawyers think is sick enough to warrant a procedure. And then on my other end, where I work in an abortion clinic where abortion is more protected by the state constitution, people drive 12 hours just to see me for pills that have the safety profile of that they should be sold in a vending machine. We know, I think Mardge probably referenced this, but the Turnaway study is a large study that was done looking at the consequences of patients that were not able to receive an abortion. And if, the study is like long, but there's like good 1 and 2 page summaries that you can find online. But as Mardge said, there are significant financial and societal costs to not having that autonomy over your own body. And for us in Ohio, what we see is also a significant healthcare burden on these patients as well. When, we deem that someone needs an abortion for medical reasons, but the hospital lawyers don't agree with us, there's a significant wait time involved in getting that patient the out-of-state care they need. And in the meantime, they could get devastatingly ill. There's confusion. We recently had a patient in the emergency room who was miscarrying, and she didn't know she was pregnant because she had an IUD, and she was essentially left alone hemorrhaging in the ED because our ED staff was unfamiliar with the law. And I think sometimes like the individual patient suffering gets lost among all of it. But sometimes I think the saddest part is that like I don't really see a very clear way out of it, but I know we'll hopefully get there one day. But that's all I have.
All right.
For now.
Thank you, May. I can tell that just, listening to how you're talking about this, about there's not just pain in this for the patients and not just pain in it for the families and difficulties and fear there, but now we've got doctors who feel like they're under the gun. Will they lose their license? Will they not be able to practice specialty that they've learned? I mean, these are all kind of horrible situations for physicians to be in. And, we've kind of gotten calluses on the places where the insurance companies are beating up on us about this stuff, playing Mother May I about what we could do. But at least I didn't have to consult, an attorney every time I made a medical decision. To me, this is a horrific situation for physicians and for patients to be in, and obviously a very dangerous one too, for all parties concerned. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions. And I don't know whether the chat is open. I think the chat is open. Looks like we've got 16 things there. NJ, have you been monitoring the chat? Do we have some questions we'd like to pump out to our panelists? In the meantime, I'll throw something out, that I think is a concern for me. Many times we've talked within Physicians for a National Health Program about under these sort of circumstances where we see this kind of injustice, what is the role of civil disobedience on the part of doctors and nurses? Is there a role for civil disobedience, and what would that look like? So I'm asking, we've got an attorney in Steve Wagner, and we've got two physicians who are activists. I don't know whether there's been any thoughts about that issue, but I think it's a very difficult thing. You don't want to separate yourself from patients who need you, and yet you can see the injustice needs to be stood against. And so how do we do that? How do we regularly make it clear to our patients and our communities that we see this injustice and that we do not want to participate in it? Thoughts from you, Mardge, or from you, May, or from Steve on the issue of civil disobedience with regard to?
Yeah, I think there's been, I know one article already in the literature on this, which sort of put it out as something for people to consider. But I'm really struck by May's sincerity and sort of what you've experienced and what you're feeling, and sort of the exhaustion that you shared with us. And it's just so tragic. What we need in addition, I mean, we need lots of loud support, and whether that's civil disobedience, it might be, but it's not the kind of thing that an individual physician can do by themselves. That's what I've always sort of felt, but I'm definitely getting from May's what she shared with us tonight, which was really very important to share. It's very serious. I mean, that's what I try to put out, that it has a really tremendous effect. I mean, neither of us talked about the fact that with medical abortions, pills, there won't be the deaths that we saw probably, but there'll be some incredible hardships and some horrible, close to, you talked about someone hemorrhaging and people didn't know what they were doing. So there is going to be an enormous amount of morbidity. But we don't want it to have to be that someone has to die or get arrested, doing the right thing to have this change. So I think there have to be a lot of concerted efforts. You can imagine that there can be, groups of physicians in a hospital and or a city come out, at noon on a particularly significant day and say, this is not what we believe in. We don't want this. We're against this. I know some of us are planning a demonstration on Sunday at the American Public Health Association after the opening session to have public health workers be very, very loud and outside, and not just in an academic setting, say that we don't want this decision. And we really want to envision and participate in a world that actually has reproductive justice. And that's what I heard from May's talk. So it does mean we have to take you think about what's going on in Iran. Those women are so courageous. If we could only have like a 10th or 100th of their courage, we would probably be able to do a whole lot.
I think like civil disobedience is an easier thing to think about than actually do. And I've been surprised at how unprotected I am in an academic institution, and you are not as safe as you seem. And there are people, I have been told that there have been people who have seriously tried to have me fired, but luckily I have stuck to the protocols and the laws faithfully. And I would agree with Mardge, it's not something one person can do. It's, my license, there's civil and criminal penalties. Luckily, there's been nothing coming out of Texas or Oklahoma. So I feel like for the most part, they're not going to come after an academic MFM. But, abortion fighters also have lives and families, and we cannot feel comfortable sitting in our ivory towers. And, I see a lot of it on social media, why don't you do this? Or why don't the doctors do this? And they just don't get it.
All right, NJ, you've been monitoring, or Deb, if you've been monitoring questions, let's move along. Thanks, Mardge and May, for your thoughts on that particular issue. I suspect that most of the people that are on this are in support of reproductive health and reproductive justice, and we're looking for ways to be supportive for people like you, May, or, in a broader sense, to change the political environment in which you're trying to practice medicine. So what you got question-wise there?
Sure. So in the chat, just moving back for a second, Steve actually had already answered this question, but just in case people hadn't seen it. So there was a question of whether or not the Medicare being allowed to negotiate for drug prices was a cumulative numbers over the years, and yes was the answer that Steve gave. I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit more. They had asked whether the insulin benefit of $35 starts in 2023 for those on Medicare.
Sure. So yes, does start the insulin, the cap on the insulin copay does start in 2023 for Medicare. Yes, those numbers about the drugs that phase in become cumulative. So the 10 that are chosen in the first year are still subject to negotiation in the later years as additional drugs are added. And then I think there was another question that had to do with the drugs that could be added under Part B. Part B are drugs that are provided, actually administered by the provider in the office. So those are slightly different than, those are not drugs that you're going to the pharmacy to get. So, and they have to have been purchased by the provider and then administered in the office. So that's that distinction of the types of drugs that are going to be available for negotiation.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe I'll throw in a comment here on that issue. $2,000. I think I last read that they're less than a third of American families could handle an expense of $500, let alone $2,000. And we're talking about a vulnerable population of older people and probably sicker people, or they wouldn't be spending $2,000 on drugs. So that $2,000 maybe to rich Congress people and senators doesn't sound like much, but for a lower class, working class family, you're talking about a significant barrier again, and again forcing people to choose between food or housing or transportation and their medication. So although it's better than nothing, it feels to me like it's not all that generous in terms of that limit. And again, especially because if you're spending $2,000 on drugs, you're probably pretty sick. You're going to spend it again next year and the next year and the next year, right? This isn't a lifetime $2,000 limit. This is an annual $2,000 limit. So I suppose better some limit than no limit. One of our people had me to give a talk in Lima, Chris Elstro, and one person who was at that talk said they were spending thousands of dollars a month on medication to control an autoimmune problem. So, I'm just looking at this and recognizing that, it's some protection, but boy, it's really pretty inadequate in my mind. Although better something than nothing again, I would say, and we'll see how those negotiations go. One drug at a time, it's almost like water torture in some ways, and all the haggling that's going to occur around it. So next question, NJ.
Yeah, next question we have Bill Davis. You can go ahead.
Hi, I thought I'd ask Steve if you could tell us why there isn't some issue here, some kind of problem in the State House with legislators passing laws that appear to be attempting to practice medicine without a license, I'm sure. This is beyond me.
Well, I don't think I can really address. Yes, the legislators, whether they are ill-informed about the practice of medicine, or even how reproduction works, some seem to be challenged in that way. But I would suggest that until we can address gerrymandering and until we can get the vote out there, that's unlikely to change in Ohio's legislature.
Next up, I think we have a question from Michael Massey.
Yeah, Massey. I had a question for Mardge and May, but I think May stepped away for a call. I just had a question for medical students, I guess, who are interested in reproductive health care advocacy. What would you how would you advise the next generation of physicians coming up to be an advocate on this issue without, I guess, jeopardizing their career, but actually making an impact?
I think it's a great question. Thank you. And thanks for all you do already. I see your backdrop shows us that you're very committed. And I think actually that's what's giving me the answer in my mind, to what you're asking. It's important to think of us being part of a movement, that these issues are very connected. I think single payer, a high quality single payer, is very, very connected to why we have to fight for abortion, high quality abortion and reproductive services and reproductive justice for everybody in this country. I can't separate them. We want a healthcare system where it's not top down. It's that the people decide what are the most important issues, and they have the resources that are collectively available to them to actually work on those issues and partner with healthcare providers. That's sort of a good image, I think, for students to participate in and to sort of always work towards that. And it's a hard haul right now, I think, as for being students. You have an enormous amount to learn, and then, we ask you to be part of all this other stuff. But I think what I learned in my career as a physician was that motivation to keep doing comes from understanding what the individual patient in front of you is feeling and what you can do to change that, but what you both can do together to advocate for the system changes that we need. And I think you have to have a group of students with you. Hopefully that SNAP chapter or whatever you're part of, you have that. And because you can't, again, making the world better is something we have to do it, but we have to enjoy it while we do it. And I think you need others around you to help make that happen. So I think you have to read, you have to argue with each other, you have to think of tactics that people have done to make where you work equitable and fair, and where you study and learn, because you're quickly inside hospitals. I don't know if you're a medical student. Is that what, if you're a medical student? Yeah, so you're quickly inside care systems that have their inequities, and be there and work with a group of people, never by yourself, to make the necessary noise to make the change. Think of good models.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
So the next question from the chat, and then we'll do Tim next. A couple of people have raised the point on how they can get involved with maybe a ballot initiative to move forward for Ohio, putting reproductive rights as a guarantee. There's been some answers in the chat about Ohio ballot initiative and the groups that are moving forward with that, but I don't know if the speakers wanted to talk or if you guys knew a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm unaware of any immediate thing that's going on. I don't know whether, Steve, you're aware of any organizations that are moving on a ballot initiative. It's hard to do in Ohio. I mean,
well, they're saying in the chat, John, that it's the groups that are commonly together, ACLU, Planned Parenthood, and I don't know if it's called NAREL where you are, it changes name to Health Equity where we are. And Physicians for Reproductive Health. So I think there is one that they're working on with those groups.
Yeah. Well, again, the barrier is higher in Ohio than it is in some places, because we actually tried to do an initiative for a single payer in Ohio and managed to collect 140,000 signatures. But they changed the rules in the midst of it, and you had to collect that number or more because you can have bad signatures. And then you had to do a second time. If they just sat on it, you had to do it a second time to force it onto the ballot. And again, a scrappy grassroots group like Span Ohio, and we just don't have the resources to pay, signature gatherers. Now, maybe, multiple groups getting together, maybe we can do it. I don't know, but it's not a straightforward thing here. It's not that easy because of the numbers of signatures that are needed and that ability of the legislature just to hip pocket it and not act on it. And to move forward. We actually had an experience with that just on the gerrymandering, and Steve, you might want to comment on that, but the League of Women Voters and a couple of other groups had done an initiative petition in Ohio to have an independent commission set the boundaries for our districts. And the League of Women Voters, who was key to that, was talked out of actually putting it on the ballot. And of course, then they ran the clock on this particular election. So we're stuck with all these bad districts again, because basically the legislature lied to League of Women Voters. They made promises about what would happen and it didn't happen. And the Supreme Court got involved. So
yeah, I'd like to ask Jean Corwin, who's one of the people here tonight, to talk about that issue of getting this on the ballot, because she seems to have the most information. Jean, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, I was eating a big bowl of ice cream. That's why the video was off. Dark times, right? So it's this ballot initiative, Jonathan, is in the very early stages, but once the language is agreed upon, then the decision is going to have to be made whether it's going to happen. The decision is going to have to be made whether it's in the 23 or 24 election. If Michigan passes its ballot initiative this November, I believe there will be a lot of pressure on the group to put it on the ballot for 23. And the group is estimating that it will have to raise at least $20 million to hire people to get the signatures. So no, they're going into this in a realistic, you have to hire, as you said, a certain number of people so you can get the right number and demographic of signatures to get it on the ballot.
Yeah, you've got to do it twice. So it's a lot of money and a long haul to get it done. And the second one, you only have 3 months to get it done.
Right, that's why it costs so much money.
And that depends. If it's a constitutional amendment, you do it once, but you have to have more signatures to start out with. I think it's 5% from each county and, from at least half of the counties. If it's just a legislative issue and it's not meant to go into the Constitution, that's where you got the 2 rounds that are going there.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, this is constitutional, 1 round. Michigan got 750,000 signatures in the right amount of time, and they only needed 450,000. So this is going to be a bellwether, and we need to see what happens in Michigan this November.
Okay. Thanks, Jean. All right, back to questions or hands up.
So we, Tim, you had your hand up, but it went down. So I'm not sure if you still wanted to comment.
My question was about the initiative, ballot initiative. So it's already been.
Great. Well, thank you. So somebody in the chat had said, could Mardge comment on the cause for reproductive justice allying with other groups fighting for medical autonomy, for example, medical right to refuse constitutional amendment?
Which other groups? Wait, just let me understand the question.
I think the question is, how do we bring together groups that are concerned about this? I
think that's probably.
Yeah,
well, how do we build a movement out of these chunks and pieces that we have, right? How do we as SPAN Ohio or UCAN Ohio stand up with physicians for reproductive health and rights?
Well, I think you start talking with each other and you start working together, or you plan a demonstration in support of people like May. I mean, I think, we connect how a single payer system or a rational, decent, not greed-driven healthcare system would take women's lives seriously. I mean, I think we all yearn for like a movement that is inclusive of all these issues that we care about. And we it's for young people to do more than some of us, I believe strongly, and we should follow their lead, but we have to really deal with the race issues and the class issues. And we have to be much more inclusive to build the kind of movement we all liked decades back, and hopefully we'll make the changes. I don't have any, I think you just have to keep at it is what I've learned. Keep at it and struggle to, learn information, phrase the in long sentences, not just quips, so that we actually understand what's causing the problems and fight as hard as we can to make change. But I think it's quite doable. But we're at a rough place right now. I mean, that's what this was an amazing discussion, especially because of the honesty, that May put forth. And we have to hone in on that and figure out a way to be really supportive and really strong, so that people stay at it, people feel loved, people feel cared for. I don't know. I think it's all of those things.
I mean, certainly for me, being inside an unjust system, the one thing that has kept me from moral injury, I guess that's the new term that we talk about, where we physicians, feel like we can't do the right thing. It's always been the activism. And so the activism is kind of an antidote for that depression that we fall into when we look around and feel like we don't have control over doing the best thing for our patients or the best things for ourselves as physicians. So certainly you're right. It's going to take younger people than you and I, but I intend to run through the tape. I know you do, Mardge. We're going to run through the tape, guys. They're going to bury me with a single payer insignia on my casket, probably. But the fact is that it is what keeps you sane, is trying to do the best you can in solidarity with other groups, whether it's unions or church groups or whoever else will come to the fore to try and help us create a just healthcare system. So any additional chats here, NJ? You looking? go ahead. Yeah, you got something, Mardge, that you wanted to, or May, I don't know what you have more. I mean, May, I think
Don,
probably.
did you have a question? I think Don had his hand up. No?
No? All right.
Okay.
If you do, stick your hand up because we're probably beginning to dwindle here a bit. I would encourage May, we'll stay in contact. This group, I think, we're active all over the state, and I think you could probably count on our support. I suspect, given I'm on the board of UHCAN as well, that we probably could get UHCAN to stand up for this, for reproductive justice. And I think that we all have connections with other groups where we can speak publicly about this issue and what it's doing to our caregivers and what it's doing to our patients. So let's one last round here for anybody who wants to chime in or has anything more to say. I
would just say that the chat has a lot of wonderful comments by people trying to do things to stay strong and participate in building that movement. So it's nice.
Okay.
You should probably save the chat so you would know who it is.
If I knew how to do that, I would. No, but others do. So I'm sure we'll hang on to it. And we promise if there's some questions in there that haven't been addressed, May, would you be willing to handle a forwarded question, or you, Mardge, if we forwarded a question to your email to allow you to respond to them if we've missed anybody tonight?
John?
Yes,
John,
go ahead. Yes.
John Rucknagel had his hand up. He's raising his hands.
All right, Don, where are you? You want to ask a question? You are. So can you unmute yourself, Don? Go ahead.
Is there an organization that facilitates women transporting to a state where they can get an abortion?
May, did you want to handle that?
Yeah, there are several. So, virtually any abortion fund group will help with that. But they just need money.
Yeah.
Because it's very, very expensive for all of this.
And the further they have to travel, the more expensive it is. And in some places that travel is a heck of a long way.
Yeah. So, our Good Ohio one is Abortion Fund of Ohio, Justice Fund. There's many out there and they all do excellent work.
So we are trying to help women who are stuck in these, situations in states where, there's either it's unclear or they genuinely need help. But remember that sometimes, May, you know this better than all of us. I mean, there are times where there's not a whole lot of time to make these decisions. You have a partial miscarriage where there might still be a heartbeat in it, but it's your ticking clock for sepsis and things like that. I mean, these are just very difficult situations, where as usual, we have to rely on the patient and the doctors to work through these problems, and they can be very painful and very difficult. I know certainly that was my experience as a primary care internist, talking with women who were willing to discuss the need for an abortion with me. And I can tell you that it was never simple. It was just never simple. There are a lot of different things that are going on behind the scenes. And certainly here in Ohio, our legislature feels like they can just make it simple. The answer is no. And that's inhumane and unjust. I see Bob Parker has his hand up. Bob, can you unmute yourself? There he is.
Okay, I just put into the chat a link. There's a rally coming up this Thursday in Cleveland. So if you're in the Cleveland area, the so-called crisis pregnancy centers, which do not really give true information. They're not really medical centers. So there's a coalition that's going to be protesting there. It's at 39th and Lorraine on the near west side. And there's a link in the chat for that.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, those, they make it sound like they're there to help, and what they're really there to do is to seal people off from seeking reproductive care.
Okay.
I don't think unless there's something more, I think we're pretty much, hammered at this a bit, and I'm sure we'll be back in contact, May. And I think our group is going to want to be as supportive as we can be of physicians for reproductive health and rights. And I'm sure that Steve won't mind me putting this issue of support on the UHCAN Ohio agenda as well, given I'm on that board as well. And I know that my colleagues on Michigan for Single Payer, because I'm on that board as well, they're hot about this. They're out there working their tails on the reproductive rights into the Constitution of Michigan. I know that's kind of occupied everybody's activities rather than the ordinary Medicare for All stuff that we are involved in. So any final comments from anybody? If not, I think we can say good night. Thank you very much for participating.